Hi guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most haunting chapters of modern history, the Great Smog of London, December 1952. Imagine a fog so thick you couldn't see your own feet, a darkness at noon that carried death in every breath. Over just a few days, thousands of lives were quietly taken, and a city was brought to a standstill. This is not just a story of weather, it is a story of neglect, survival, and a turning point for public health. Now let's begin slowly, calmly, and uncover how it all started. If you appreciate calm, reflective journeys through forgotten times, don't forget to tap like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching, and tell me, what hidden story should we uncover together next? In the early days of December 1952, Londoners were used to fog. The city had been cloaked in mists for centuries, so much so that fog had become part of London's character. Writers and painters romanticised the smoky haze, calling it the London particular. But what began on December 5th was not the familiar kind of mist. A high-pressure system had settled over southern England, creating a cold, still air that acted like a lid over the city. Normally, winds would sweep away smoke and industrial exhaust. But now the air did not move. Every chimney, every factory, and every bus poured soot and sulphur into a bowl of stagnant atmosphere. The more coal burned, the thicker the fog became, clinging low to the streets. By morning, visibility had shrunk to just a few yards. Streetlights struggled to pierce the gloom, glowing like faint candles swallowed by a blanket of shadow. People walking to work found themselves lost on roads they had travelled every day. Bus drivers could not see the curb, trains slowed to a crawl, and yet, at first, few were alarmed. London had seen pea soup fogs before. People believed it would lift by evening. Instead, it deepened. As day turned to night, the fog did not leave. It thickened, yellow-brown with soot and reeking of coal smoke. Housewives who opened their windows found black film settling on their curtains. Children coughed as the air filled their lungs with an invisible poison. Still, life in the city went on. Theatres stayed open, though actors could barely be seen on stage. Cinemas kept running films, even as patrons coughed in the smoky air inside. Some Londoners treated it as an inconvenience, carrying on with scarves over their mouths. Others, more cautious, stayed home. But the smog crept into houses, seeping through cracks and under doors. The world outside was silent, muffled by the heavy air. Police officers guiding traffic walked in front of cars holding lanterns, hoping drivers would not run them down. Ambulances moved slowly, often unable to reach those who called for help. And hospitals, at first puzzled, soon found themselves filling with patients. Respiratory distress, asthma, pneumonia, and heart failure cases surged. Doctors struggled to understand why so many were collapsing, why so many could not catch their breath. For 4 long days the smog refused to lift. By December the 9th, London was paralysed. Flights were grounded, buses stopped running, and even funerals were delayed because mourners could not see their way through the cemetery gates. Horses panicked in the streets, blinded by the darkness. In some neighbourhoods, people carried torches and lanterns, moving like shadows through a silent nightmare. The worst was not only the darkness, but the poison in the air. This fog was not made of water droplets alone. It carried sulphur dioxide, hydrochloric acid, and a deadly mix of fine particles from coal smoke. Every breath cut into the lungs, inflaming them, thickening the blood, straining the heart. Children, the elderly, and those already weak suffered most. Londoners had no idea that each moment in the fog was stealing lives. They thought it was just another fog, one of many in London's long history. But this was different. By the time the skies finally cleared, the city would realise the truth. Thousands were gone, silently claimed by the air they breathed. And in the shadows of that December, a new awareness was born. An awareness that would change how societies thought about the air around them forever. As the smog settled deeper into the city on December 6th, London began to feel the weight of something far more sinister than a passing weather pattern. The high-pressure system kept the atmosphere locked, trapping the emissions from hundreds of thousands of coal fires burning in homes, factories and power stations. In those post-war years, coal was not just a fuel, it was the lifeblood of daily existence. People used it to heat their houses, to power trains, and to keep the city's machinery alive. But this same coal, soft and smoky, filled the air with sulphur and soot. Normally, winds would whisk it away into the skies. Now, with no movement in the air, it drifted downward, clinging to every surface and every lung it touched. The morning fog was not just thick, it was tactile. People described it as greasy, a substance that clung to their coats and faces. It coated the skin and left a bitter taste on the tongue. Horses and dogs walked nervously, sensing danger in the air. Even milk deliveries slowed, with drivers stumbling along streets they could not see. Inside homes, curtains stained yellow and water left on windowsills turned black with soot particles. The city grew quieter each hour, as the normal clamour of traffic and footsteps was absorbed by the heavy air. In many places sound travelled strangely, muffled and distorted. Voices carried in odd directions, leaving people confused about where calls were coming from. Lanterns glowed dim, streetlights flickered faintly, but the visibility was still so poor that pedestrians walked with their hands outstretched, searching for walls or railings to guide them. Ambulances tried to respond to calls but often had to stop. Drivers could not find addresses, and sometimes even the hospitals themselves seemed to vanish into the fog. Theatres in the West End struggled on. A few shows continued, but the audiences coughed and wheezed, and actors stumbled over unseen stage edges. Cinemas filled with people seeking refuge, but the smog seeped indoors, clouding the air even there. Schools debated closing, though many children were already too ill to attend. By evening, hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors noticed patterns. Elderly patients arrived gasping, their chests heaving, their blood pressure spiking. Young children, too, struggled, their lungs unable to fight against the dense air. Nurses and doctors worked in silence, their white uniforms quickly smudged with soot as the hospital ventilation drew the toxic air inside. The death toll was climbing, though few realised it yet. For most Londoners, it was still a waiting game, hoping the fog would lift as it always had. But day turned to night, and the city remained entombed. On the streets, buses were abandoned because drivers could not see more than a yard ahead. Trains moved so slowly they were nearly useless. River traffic on the Thames ground to a halt. Even funerals were postponed, with hearses unable to find cemeteries. Life itself seemed suspended. What frightened many was not just the stillness, but the silence. London, a city of noise and bustle, felt muted, trapped beneath a choking blanket. People pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, believing it offered protection, but the particles were too fine, too pervasive. The smog seeped through fabric, through brickwork, through the lungs of every living thing. That Saturday evening the sense of unease deepened. Neighbours checked on one another, whispering about strange coughs and sudden collapses. But still, no one imagined that the fog itself could be lethal. It was simply too vast, too ordinary seeming for most to accept as an enemy. Yet in those hours, behind closed doors, hundreds were already slipping quietly away, their breath stolen by the air they could not escape. By the morning of December 7th, the smog had become something uncanny, a presence that felt almost alive. Londoners woke to a darkness that belonged to midnight, not morning. Curtains were drawn back to reveal nothing but a dense brown wall pressing against the glass. The fog was no longer an inconvenience, it was an invader. People stepped outside and described the sensation of breathing in smoke as if they had lit a fire inside their lungs. Even the healthiest adults found themselves coughing after only a few minutes outdoors. For the vulnerable, every step into the street felt like stepping into poison. At first, many tried to carry on. Shops opened, though customers rarely came. Clerks sat behind counters wrapped in scarves, their eyes watering, their throats raw. In the markets, traders struggled to keep stalls open, waving smoke away from crates of vegetables that quickly blackened on the surface. A few butchers and grocers decided to shut their doors completely, unable to preserve food in the heavy contaminated air. The animals in the city suffered as well. Horses pulling carts stumbled, panicked by the lack of visibility, their handlers whispering calming words into ears they could barely see. Dogs on leashes whined and refused to walk, noses filled with sulphur and soot. Birds disappeared from sight, their songs absent from the stillness. Even livestock on the city's outskirts coughed and wheezed, their bodies weighed down by the foul air. Transportation was nearly impossible. Taxis crawled along at walking speed, headlights glowing like dim lanterns swallowed by shadow. Some drivers gave up entirely, leaving their cars parked until the fog cleared. Underground trains still ran, offering one of the few reliable ways to move across the city, and many Londoners crowded into the stations, grateful for even a small escape from the suffocating streets above. Hospitals reached a breaking point that Sunday. Corridors filled with patients wheeled in on stretchers, coughing violently, struggling for oxygen. Doctors tried oxygen masks, but supplies quickly ran low. The demand was endless, and each breath of outside air only worsened conditions. Nurses reported that even in maternity wards, newborn infants developed breathing difficulties, their tiny lungs unable to resist the invisible weight pressing down. The psychological toll deepened. Parents grew anxious watching their children choke on air. Elderly men and women sat wrapped in blankets, staring out windows at the strange permanent dusk that had replaced daylight. Stories spread of people collapsing on their way to work, or failing to return home from errands. Yet the government remained largely silent, offering no warnings, no coordinated response. For officials, it was still just another fog, one of many that had defined London's history. But to those living through it, the smog was beginning to feel like a curse, something unearthly that had settled over the city and refused to leave. On that third day, London stood still, trapped in an atmosphere that offered neither escape nor relief. The fog was no longer a backdrop to life. It had become life itself, the air every Londoner breathed, the shadow in every room, the danger at every turn. By December 8th, the smog had tightened its grip so completely that London felt like a city under siege. People no longer spoke of inconvenience, they spoke of survival. What unsettled many was not just the choking air, but the sense that time itself had slowed. Days and nights blended together, each hour dim and muffled, the sun hidden behind a curtain of yellow-brown haze. It was as though the city had been dropped into another world, one without clarity, colour or breath. Londoners tried to adapt in small ways. Shopkeepers lit candles during the day, their flames barely cutting through the gloom. Commuters walked with arms outstretched, tracing walls and fences to find their way. Neighbours formed small groups, linking hands so no one would vanish into the fog while crossing a street. Yet accidents continued. Reports spread of buses ramming into lampposts, cars stalling in ditches, and pedestrians stumbling into the Thames, unable to see the riverbank until it was too late. Funerals, delayed since the smog began, added another layer of tragedy. Coffins waited in churches while families prayed for the air to lift so loved ones could be buried. Horses pulling hearses balked at moving forward, frightened by the dark veil smothering the city. Even mourners wore scarves tight over their mouths, coughing through the final rites. Hospitals by then were overwhelmed far beyond capacity. Nurses wrote in their logs that the air inside wards was no better than the streets outside. Ventilation systems pulled in the toxic fog, coating white walls with grey stains. Patients gasped in crowded hallways, sometimes lying 2 or 3 to a bed. Doctors described the sound of the smog in human lungs, a wet rattle, relentless, impossible to quiet. Oxygen tanks were rationed, yet it never seemed enough. Children, elders, and those with fragile health slipped away quietly, their lives claimed not by illness in the usual sense, but by the very air itself. And still, officials hesitated. Parliament continued business, records showing debates that skirted around the crisis, calling it a weather event rather than a public emergency. For Londoners, that silence was deafening. They lit fires in their homes to stay warm, never realising that each coal burned made the smog thicker, the air heavier, the danger greater. The streets grew emptier. Markets thinned as traders packed up their wares, unable to sell food that spoiled in the sulphur-tainted damp. Theatres, once determined to remain open, began to cancel shows when actors fainted backstage or audiences failed to arrive. Cinemas grew empty, their screens flickering for only a handful of determined viewers. By the fourth day, the smog was no longer just a nuisance, or even just a killer. It had become a presence woven into every thought, every movement. London had faced bombings, fires and plagues across its long history. But this was something different. It was silent, invisible and intimate. It was inside every breath, a quiet invader that could not be fought with walls or weapons. As December 8th ended, the question pressing on every mind was simple yet terrifying. Would the fog ever leave, or had the city entered into a darkness without end? On December 9th, the smog pressed down harder than ever before. London was no longer functioning as a city. It was stumbling through a disaster without a name. By morning, visibility in some districts was measured in inches. People leaned forward, faces nearly brushing the ground, trying to see the pavement beneath their feet. Drivers abandoned vehicles altogether, leaving them stranded at odd angles across streets. Trains crawled, whistles echoing into a darkness that swallowed sound. The air was thick enough to taste, bitter, acrid and metallic. Every breath burned. Those who had once braved the fog now refused to leave their homes. Families huddled indoors, stuffing wet cloths under doorways, hoping to keep the poison from creeping inside. But it did. It slid through every crack, staining wallpaper, filling kitchens, coating furniture with a film of soot. Even in the safety of bedrooms, children coughed through the night. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, began turning patients away. Doctors had no more beds, no more oxygen, no more hands to treat the endless stream of suffering. Nurses wrote of wards filled with the constant rattle of lungs, a chorus of gasps and wheezes that never ceased. Ambulances stood idle, unable to navigate the streets. Calls for help went unanswered. In poorer neighbourhoods, where coal burned constantly in small stoves, the toll was heaviest. Families with little insulation or protection breathed deeply of the thickened smog, their homes becoming traps instead of shelters. Reports spread of entire households falling ill together. Even animals could not escape. Cattle on the city's edge lay in fields, their sides heaving with each ragged breath. Dogs wandered blindly, eyes watering, some collapsing in doorways. Horses, once steady companions of London life, stood trembling, unable to move through the darkness. Meanwhile, officials insisted that the smog would soon clear. They called it temporary, seasonal, unfortunate, but not deadly. Newspapers carried bland reassurances. For ordinary Londoners, this silence from leadership felt surreal, as though the crisis was happening in two different worlds, one of denial in Parliament and one of quiet desperation in the streets. Businesses closed, schools emptied, and entire neighbourhoods slipped into a forced stillness. Funeral homes overflowed, unable to bury the mounting dead. Some coffins stood stacked in halls, waiting for air clear enough to carry them to the ground. That Tuesday the city felt suspended between life and death, between endurance and collapse. The fog had become more than weather. It was a force, relentless and intimate, pressing into lungs and homes, holding London hostage. And yet, there was still no end in sight. By December 10th, London was suffocating. The fog had lingered for 5 endless days, and every hour deepened the sense of dread. What began as an inconvenience had grown into a silent disaster of unimaginable scale. Entire districts seemed frozen, their usual rhythm erased. Markets remained shuttered, buses abandoned, and the Thames carried no traffic at all. The river itself was hidden beneath the veil, its surface eerily quiet. Above ground, people walked like shadows, hunched figures clutching scarves to their mouths, their footsteps muffled on streets no longer alive with sound. For those still braving the outdoors, each breath was an assault. The smog carried not just soot, but sulfur dioxide and other toxic compounds. It irritated eyes until tears streamed constantly, clouding vision even further. Throats burned, lungs tightened, and the act of inhaling felt like dragging smoke from a fire. People moved slowly, pausing to catch their breath every few yards. Some collapsed mid-stride, strangers kneeling beside them, helpless. Hospitals reached breaking point. The emergency wards overflowed with patients in crisis. Children gasping, elderly men turning blue, women clutching their chests as their hearts strained against the poisoned air. Doctors could do little more than provide oxygen, but supplies dwindled rapidly. Nurses described a city-wide exhaustion, as if London itself had caught an illness no one could cure. Reports began to surface of mortality numbers higher than anyone dared whisper aloud. Though official statements still downplayed the crisis, undertakers and morgues knew the truth. They were overwhelmed. Refrigeration was scarce, and coffins piled in storage rooms. Families waited days to hold funerals, the air too thick for safe processions. Even inside homes, death came quietly. Many passed away in their beds, never making it to a hospital. Poorer neighbourhoods bore the heaviest toll. Small coal fires burned constantly in crowded flats, feeding the smog and poisoning the very families who relied on them for warmth. Parents held damp cloths over their children's faces, praying it would help, but the invisible particles passed easily through. Infants coughed in their cribs, their lungs too fragile to endure. Animals suffered alongside humans. Livestock wheezed in barns. Pigeons vanished from rooftops, and even the city's police horses fell ill, their breathing laboured and uneven. The silence of absent birdsong, the dimness of days without sun, and the endless coughing of neighbours created an atmosphere almost otherworldly. London had survived bombings, blackouts and rationing during the war, but those had come with warnings and explanations. This, however, was a quiet, creeping enemy, one that offered no sirens, no shelters, no instructions. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. On that final day, as whispers spread that winds might be returning, people clung to hope. But hope was fragile, and the smog remained, clinging to chimneys, alleyways, and lungs. For thousands, it was already too late. When the winds finally shifted on December 11th, London began to breathe again, but the relief was slow and uneasy. At first, the change was almost imperceptible, a faint stirring in the air, a thinning of the heavy blanket that had suffocated the city for nearly a week. By afternoon, the smog began to lift in patches, revealing outlines of buildings and streets long swallowed by the gloom. People emerged cautiously from their homes, blinking at the weak daylight, stunned by the sight of a city half revealed after days of darkness. Yet the return of visibility brought no comfort. Instead, it revealed the cost. Ambulances crowded hospital entrances, their sirens quiet but their cargo heavy. Funeral homes overflowed, and newspapers, once muted in tone, began to acknowledge that the event was not ordinary fog at all. It was a disaster. Within days, estimates of the dead reached into the thousands. Official records initially claimed about 4,000, though later studies would suggest that as many as 12,000 had perished, and many more were left with lasting health problems. The victims had not died in public spectacle. They had passed quietly, in their beds, in hospital corridors, or on street corners where no help could reach them. Families spoke of the loved ones who seemed healthy one day and gone the next, their lungs unable to fight against the thickened air. The government faced growing criticism for its silence. For 5 days, officials had insisted the smog was nothing unusual, even as the city choked. Now, as the truth unfolded, anger simmered. Citizens asked why no warnings had been issued, Why no steps had been taken to limit exposure? Why so many had been left to suffer without aid? Parliament debated the issue, but answers were slow and hesitant. In homes across London, grief replaced fear. Black crape appeared on doors, neighbours offered condolences, and churches filled with mourners. The smog, once thought to be a fleeting inconvenience, had become a marker in memory, a week no one could forget. The city's identity itself seemed shaken. London had always been associated with fog, but this was different. This was not a romantic haze from paintings or novels. It was a killer, silent and efficient. Survivors described the atmosphere afterward as surreal, as if waking from a nightmare into a city that looked the same but felt irreversibly changed. The smog had passed, but its shadow lingered in lungs, in grief, and in the uneasy knowledge that such a thing could happen again. In the days that followed the smog's retreat, London tried to return to normal, but the weight of what had happened pressed on every corner of the city. Streets reopened, buses moved again, and shopkeepers swept soot from their doorsteps, but nothing felt ordinary. People walked cautiously, glancing at the sky as though expecting the darkness to descend again. A cough lingered in many throats, a constant reminder of the poison they had endured. Doctors reported a wave of patients long after the fog had lifted. Men and women with inflamed lungs, weakened hearts, and damaged airways. For some, the effects would last weeks. For others, the harm would follow them for the rest of their lives. The numbers continued to climb, silent proof that the smog had left scars beyond its immediate toll. Newspapers, at last, began to speak openly. Headlines shifted from neutral descriptions of pea soup fog to alarming accounts of a public health catastrophe. Letters poured in from citizens describing scenes of confusion and loss, funerals delayed, children gasping for breath, neighbours who never woke. The press demanded answers from Parliament, pressing officials on why no warnings had been issued. Why had the city not acted? The government struggled with its response. At first, it downplayed the numbers, fearful of panic and political fallout. But as mortality statistics rose, denial became impossible. The smog was no accident of weather alone. It was a product of human choices. The burning of cheap coal, the reliance on outdated heating methods, and the absence of environmental safeguards had all combined to create a deadly atmosphere. For many Londoners, this realization deepened the sense of betrayal. They had lived and died in the shadow of decisions made far above their reach. In neighbourhoods hardest hit, grief turned into quiet anger. Families who had lost loved ones gathered in churches and community halls, sharing stories and demanding change. They wanted assurances that such a disaster would not strike again. Yet those assurances were slow to come. Officials spoke of studying the matter, of considering reforms, but the machinery of government moved at its usual deliberate pace. Meanwhile, the memory of the smog settled into the fabric of daily life. Parents told their children to beware of smoky days, and shopkeepers joked grimly about selling scarves as smog masks. Behind the humour was unease, a recognition that the city's very air had become a weapon against its people. London had faced many hardships, but none so intimate as this. Bombs and wars had been external threats, but the smog had seeped into every breath. It was an enemy that came from within, and that truth would not easily be forgotten. As winter moved on, London carried the smog in its memory like a wound that refused to heal. People resumed routines, yet conversations always circled back to those 5 terrible days. At bus stops and in markets, strangers compared stories, how they had lost their way in familiar streets, how they had covered children's faces with cloths, how a neighbour had vanished into the haze and never returned. Every family seemed touched by loss, either directly or through friends. The collective grief bound the city in silence. In hospitals, doctors and scientists began analysing what had happened. They knew coal smoke was harmful, but the scale of death shocked even the experts. Research showed that fine particles in the air had penetrated deep into lungs, inflaming tissues and straining hearts. Sulfur compounds combined with the damp air to form acid that irritated every breath. The findings were clear. This was not merely fog, it was a toxic cloud manufactured by human activity. The revelation unsettled many. If ordinary life, heating homes, running buses, keeping factories alive, could generate such devastation, then safety itself seemed uncertain. The very foundation of modern living appeared to carry hidden dangers. For Londoners, the realization was frightening. The smog had not been an unpredictable accident, but an inevitable outcome of choices made for decades. Meanwhile, official numbers struggled to keep pace with reality. Early reports of 4,000 deaths seemed staggering, but as weeks passed, statisticians uncovered more. Mortality rates remained high long after the fog cleared, suggesting delayed effects. Later studies would argue that the true toll was closer to 12,000. The enormity of the loss slowly dawned on the public. Churches filled with memorial services, bells tolling not just for individuals but for the city itself. London had faced bombings, blackouts, and rationing during the war, yet those trials had been met with resilience and unity. The smog, however, left behind something different, a sense of betrayal. The enemy had not come from outside, but had been built into the very way the city functioned. Still, life went on. Markets reopened fully, theatres drew crowds again, and the river carried boats once more. Yet each smoky morning stirred unease. People glanced upward, measuring the air with wary eyes. A new awareness had taken root, one that whispered quietly. The air itself could not be trusted. London was alive but forever altered, carrying within it the silent lesson of those deadly December days. In the weeks that followed, the Great Smog of 1952 became more than just a memory. It became a subject of intense study and uneasy reflection. Scientists, doctors, and city officials met in committees, trying to understand how something so devastating could unfold in the heart of one of the world's largest cities. Reports poured in from hospitals, each more alarming than the last. Physicians described wards overflowing, corridors filled with cots, and an endless line of patients struggling for breath. Some survivors seemed to recover, only to relapse days later, their bodies weakened beyond repair. For researchers, the data confirmed what many had long suspected. London's reliance on coal had pushed the air beyond safety. For decades, smoke had been accepted as a part of life. Soot on windowsills, stains on laundry, and the smell of burning fuel were considered normal. But now, those everyday details were re-examined through a darker lens. What people had tolerated as an inconvenience was, in truth, a constant danger. Beyond health, the smog carried economic consequences. Businesses lost days of trade, transportation suffered enormous setbacks, and funeral costs mounted for families already living on tight budgets. Insurance companies faced claims they had never imagined, while city leaders faced growing pressure to prevent another disaster. In Parliament, the debate grew louder. Some politicians dismissed the smog as a rare event, unlikely to repeat. Others insisted it was a warning of far greater crises to come. The argument was not just about weather, but about the future of London's way of life. Could the city continue to depend on coal, or was it time for change? Among ordinary people, the mood was quieter but no less serious. Families who had lost loved ones spoke in hushed voices, their grief mingled with anger. Parents taught children to be wary of heavy air, and neighbours checked on one another whenever mist began to settle. The phrase smog no longer carried the neutral tone it once had. It became synonymous with fear. Meanwhile, artists, writers and journalists began capturing the tragedy in words and images. Photographs showed buses lost in a sea of grey, pedestrians holding lanterns in daylight, and nurses with soot-stained uniforms. These images circulated widely, etching the smog into collective memory. London had weathered many hardships, but this one carried a unique lesson. Danger could be invisible. woven into the very air itself. That realization left the city unsettled, cautious, and waiting for the next step. Would leaders act, or would the smog remain a shadow threatening to return with the next winter chill? As 1953 began, Londoners carried the memory of the smog into the new year like a shadow that refused to fade. Winter still hung heavy, and each morning's mist stirred quiet fear. People looked at the air differently now, as if weighing it with their eyes, searching for signs of another trap. For the first time, the very act of breathing felt uncertain. In homes across the city, families spoke about the disaster in whispers, sharing stories of neighbours lost and days when the streets had vanished. The fog had become a ghost that lingered, haunting conversations and reshaping trust in the world outside. Scientists pressed their findings, warning that the smog was not a freak event but the product of human activity. Coal smoke, once considered a sign of progress and power, was revealed as a silent poison. The cheap, low-grade coal distributed in post-war Britain had fueled countless hearths, but also filled the air with sulphur and heavy particulates. Without wind, the result had been inevitable. This truth unsettled the public. If ordinary fires, buses and factories could create death on such a scale, then modern life itself seemed unsafe. London, proud of its resilience, now faced an invisible weakness. Government officials, once cautious, began to acknowledge the need for reform. Reports were commissioned, committees formed, and the idea of clean air slowly entered public discussion. But progress moved slowly. Industry leaders resisted restrictions, citing costs and tradition. Some officials argued that the smog was unlikely to repeat, urging patience instead of action. Yet Londoners who had walked through the thickened air knew otherwise. For them, the memory was not a statistic but a lived terror. The taste of soot, the burn in their lungs, the silence of streets that should have been full of life. Meanwhile, the cultural fabric of the city absorbed the event. Writers described the smog as a plague of modern times, a punishment for neglecting the environment. Painters captured streets swallowed by yellow haze, where figures loomed like ghosts. Even school children drew pictures of dark skies and coughing neighbours. Memory turned into narrative, narrative into warning. Slowly, the great smog became not just an experience, but a symbol of fragility, proof that even mighty cities could be humbled by their own smoke. And though daily life resumed, markets reopened, theatres played, buses rolled again, the air itself had changed in the minds of Londoners. It was no longer invisible, no longer taken for granted. It was a force to be feared, questioned, and perhaps one day tamed. Throughout the spring of 1953, the debate around the Great Smog grew louder. Newspapers that once avoided alarm now published detailed accounts of the suffering. Journalists interviewed families who had lost children, spouses and grandparents, piecing together a mosaic of grief. Each story revealed the same pattern, seemingly ordinary days that ended in tragedy, with no sirens, no warnings, only silence. The weight of these voices pressed on Parliament, making it harder for officials to dismiss the event as a rare accident. Scientists joined the chorus. Reports from medical associations revealed clear links between the smog and thousands of deaths. They explained how sulfur dioxide mixed with moisture to create acid particles, how soot settled deep in lungs, how the absence of wind turned London into a sealed chamber. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet progress remained slow. Britain, still recovering from the war, depended heavily on coal. To change that reliance meant reshaping industries, households, and politics. Many leaders hesitated, fearing the cost. Still, pressure mounted. Citizens demanded action, not just for themselves but for future generations. "We cannot breathe history forever," one letter to the editor read, capturing the mood of a city that had endured too much. Cultural responses continued to grow. Writers described the fog as a beast that had swallowed London whole. Poets wrote of shadows that crept into homes, of air that betrayed its people. Painters depicted mourners walking through grey streets, lanterns glowing faintly like lost stars. The tragedy seeped into the arts, ensuring it would not be forgotten. Meanwhile, everyday life carried on with caution. Parents warned children not to play outside when misgathered. Families avoided lighting extra coal fires unless necessary. Some households experimented with cleaner fuels, though availability was limited. A sense of watchfulness became part of the rhythm of life. The Great Smog had altered the city's imagination, making people see danger where once there was only inconvenience. Within government circles, the first seeds of new laws were being discussed. Quietly, drafts circulated of proposals that would eventually lead to the Clean Air Act. It was not yet certain, but the possibility of reform flickered like a small flame in the heavy air. For London, that flame represented hope, that the darkness of December 1952 might, in the end, bring lasting change. By the summer of 1953, London had regained its outward rhythm, but beneath the surface the city was still marked by the scars of the smog. Markets bustled again, theatres filled with laughter, and boats returned to the Thames, yet conversations often drifted back to that week in December, when the city had seemed to vanish. Families who had lost loved ones carried their grief quietly, while those who had survived with damaged lungs learned to live with a new fragility. Doctors continued to document lingering health problems. Patients complained of persistent coughs, chest pain, and shortness of breath, even months later. Medical journals published case studies showing how the smog had weakened hearts and inflamed airways, especially in children and the elderly. For some, the event had shortened life expectancy in ways not yet fully understood. These reports reinforced the sense that the smog had not simply ended when the skies cleared. It had left behind a legacy written in human bodies. At the same time, public pressure for change grew stronger. Civic groups organised petitions demanding cleaner air, arguing that the deaths could not be dismissed as an unavoidable act of nature. They called for new regulations on coal, stricter oversight of factories, and investment in alternative fuels. Though officials remained cautious, the debate was shifting. Slowly, the narrative of the smog was transforming from tragedy into catalyst. Artists and writers also kept the memory alive. Novels set against the backdrop of a fog-choked London appeared, weaving fiction with fact. Plays staged scenes of families stumbling through darkness, audiences holding their breath as if reliving the suffocation. Even children's stories carried hints of the smog, warning young readers of the dangers of smoke-filled skies. Memory had become part of culture, ensuring that the event would not fade into silence. Meanwhile, life carried on with a new awareness. Londoners noticed the quality of the air in ways they never had before. A hazy morning no longer seemed harmless. It carried an edge of fear. People spoke of the weather differently, questioning forecasts and watching the horizon with wary eyes. The smog had changed the city's relationship with its own atmosphere. By the end of 1953, the Great Smog was no longer just a memory of suffering. It was a lesson, shaping conversations, policies, and imaginations. London had survived, but the air itself had become a subject of vigilance, debate, and quiet dread. By early 1954, the Great Smog had become more than a memory. It had become a matter of policy. Londoners still carried the pain of those December days, but now scientists and campaigners were determined to turn tragedy into change. Reports from the Ministry of Health confirmed what many already knew. The smog was directly linked to a massive increase in deaths. Numbers were analysed, charts drawn, and the conclusion was undeniable. The fog had not been natural. It was man-made, built from coal smoke and still air, and it could happen again. This realisation ignited debate. In Parliament, members argued about responsibility. Some insisted Britain's dependence on coal was too deep to challenge. Factories, homes, and power stations all relied on it. Others countered that human lives had to take priority over tradition. The discussions were heated, but the memory of thousands of funerals gave weight to calls for reform. For ordinary citizens, the debate was not abstract. Families still lived with the consequences. Widows managed households alone. Children grew up without grandparents, and survivors continued to cough through their days. Neighbourhoods hardest hit bore invisible scars, the rhythm of life slowed by grief. Letters to newspapers urged politicians to act, often written with a tone of weary anger. People demanded that their suffering not be forgotten in the shuffle of politics. Cultural memory also strengthened the case for change. Writers described the smog as a disaster equal in scale to wartime bombings. Painters filled canvases with ghostly streets where figures stumbled in yellow haze. Musicians composed pieces that evoked the heavy stillness, the suffocating silence of those days. The arts transformed pain into pressure, reminding the public and the government that December 1952 was not an event to dismiss. Scientists continued their research, exploring not only the smog's causes but also potential solutions. Cleaner forms of coal, restrictions on factory emissions, and shifts toward alternative heating methods were discussed. While progress was slow, the seed of reform had been planted. For the first time, Britain considered that air could be regulated, that the atmosphere was not limitless but fragile, requiring care. Meanwhile, life in London went on with caution. Misty mornings made people nervous, and parents still warned children against playing outside when the air seemed heavy. The city had not yet escaped coal smoke, but it had learned to see it differently, not as a harmless part of life, but as a potential killer. This awareness would not fade, and in the years ahead it would shape laws, habits, and the very identity of London itself. By the mid-1950s, the Great Smog had become a touchstone in discussions about public health and urban life. Its memory lingered not only in the lungs of survivors, but in the debates of policymakers and the words of newspapers that refused to let the tragedy fade. Londoners had begun to demand more than sympathy. They wanted guarantees that such an event would never be repeated. In Parliament, arguments grew sharper. Some ministers called for sweeping reforms, pointing to the thousands of deaths as undeniable evidence of failure. Others resisted, fearing the economic consequences of restricting coal use or enforcing strict factory regulations. Britain was still rebuilding after the war, and coal remained the cheapest, most accessible fuel. To change would mean cost and upheaval, yet the pressure from citizens was relentless. Letters flooded editorial pages, many written by grieving families who demanded action in memory of those lost. Activists spoke at public meetings, turning sorrow into momentum. Slowly, the language of reform began to shift from possibility to necessity. Scientists gave evidence to committees, presenting detailed studies on the effects of air pollution. They showed that the smog had not been a unique event, but part of a pattern. Smaller smogs had come before and could come again if nothing changed. These warnings cut through political hesitation, reminding everyone that the next disaster could be just as deadly. The city's culture also carried the memory forward. Authors published memoirs describing how streets vanished into yellow haze, how children stumbled home unable to see. Painters depicted London as a ghost city, lanterns glowing faintly in a world without sun. These works made the tragedy unforgettable, turning statistics into human stories. Meanwhile, ordinary life reflected the lingering anxiety. Families checked forecasts carefully, listening for warnings of stagnant air. A simple mist could stir unease, sparking memories of those days when the sky pressed down like a shroud. People lit fewer coal fires when they could, some experimenting with smokeless fuels, though availability was still limited. Gradually the smog was shaping habits as well as laws. The disaster of 1952 had taken thousands of lives, but it had also forced a city to rethink its relationship with the air itself. London was beginning to recognise that survival depended not only on strength and resilience, but on a willingness to change. That recognition would, in time, lay the groundwork for one of the most important environmental reforms in British history. By 1956, the Great Smog was no longer just a memory, but a driving force behind real political action. The tragedy of December 1952 had carved its place in public consciousness, and the demand for reform had grown too strong to ignore. Scientists had delivered their verdict, families had mourned their losses, and the press had carried stories that refused to fade. The conclusion was clear: Britain could not continue on the same path. In that year, Parliament introduced the Clean Air Act, a groundbreaking piece of legislation aimed at preventing another catastrophe. It was the first major law in Britain to directly confront the dangers of air pollution. The Act encouraged the use of smokeless fuels in homes and businesses, required industries to reduce emissions, and began the process of reshaping how Londoners lived with energy. For many, it felt like the first glimmer of safety after years of unease. Yet the transition was not simple. Coal had been central to life for generations, and shifting away from it required new infrastructure, new habits, and new ways of thinking. Households accustomed to the crackle of coal fires had to learn to use cleaner fuels, often at greater expense. Factories faced regulations that forced them to modernise, cutting costs elsewhere or passing expenses onto workers. Some resisted, complaining that the act threatened livelihoods. But for those who remembered the suffocating fog, the inconvenience seemed minor compared to the price of inaction. The law also marked a cultural turning point. London, long romanticised as a city of fog, began to shed that image. Writers who once celebrated the London particular now described it as a relic of a dangerous past. Painters moved from depicting ghostly streets toward brighter, clearer skies. The smog, once part of the city's identity, was being recast as something to banish, not embrace. Still, progress was gradual. The Clean Air Act could not erase decades of dependence overnight, and smoky days did not vanish immediately. But each year brought small improvements. Slowly, people noticed fewer stains on curtains, fewer coughs in children, and skies that revealed more of the sun. It was proof that change, while difficult, was possible. The Great Smog had claimed thousands of lives, but it had also awakened a new awareness. The air was not limitless or untouchable. It could be poisoned, but it could also be healed. The Clean Air Act stood as the first step toward that healing, a promise that London would never again endure the darkness of December 1952. The passing of the Clean Air Act in 1956 was a milestone, but its roots stretched directly back to those 5 dark days of December 1952. Without the shock of the Great Smog, such sweeping legislation might never have been possible. For Londoners, the law symbolised a recognition of their suffering, an admission that the tragedy had not been just weather, but a man-made disaster. Yet while the Act marked progress, its implementation revealed just how deeply coal was woven into the fabric of daily life. In homes, the familiar ritual of lighting a coal fire on a cold morning had been part of London's culture for generations. Families gathered around the hearth for warmth and comfort, and to many the idea of replacing it felt like losing a piece of tradition. But memory of the smog's devastation gave weight to change. Advertisements began promoting smokeless fuels, and local councils encouraged households to make the shift. Still, poorer neighbourhoods struggled. Smokeless fuel was more expensive, and not every family could afford to transition. For them, coal remained essential, even if it carried risk. Factories and industries faced similar challenges. Some adapted quickly, installing filters or switching fuels, but others resisted, citing cost. The tension between progress and tradition played out across the city, yet with each year the visible difference became harder to deny. Skies grew a little clearer, laundry came in a little cleaner, and the air lost some of its bitterness. These changes, though slow, showed that reform was not just symbolic, it was practical. Meanwhile, scientists continued to study the long-term effects of the Great Smog. Research revealed that thousands who had survived still carried weakened lungs and hearts, and mortality rates remained elevated for years afterward. The disaster was not confined to 1 week. Its echoes rippled through the health of an entire generation. This knowledge deepened the urgency of environmental awareness, reminding citizens and lawmakers alike that neglect carried invisible costs. Culturally, the memory of the smog endured. Writers described it as a moment when London had stared into its own shadow and been forced to change. Artists painted skies that balanced brightness with a lingering haze, symbolising both hope and memory. Even school lessons began to include references to the tragedy, ensuring children understood why their city looked different from the one their parents had known. By the late 1950s, London was transforming. It remained a city of resilience, but also a city that had learned humility. The Great Smog had shown that survival depended not just on courage, but on responsibility, on the willingness to protect the unseen air that connected every life. As the 1960s dawned, the Great Smog remained a fresh wound in London's collective memory. Though a decade had passed, the images of those days were not easily forgotten. The streets swallowed by shadow, the hospitals overflowing, the quiet funerals that never seemed to end. The Clean Air Act had begun to change habits, but it had not erased the cultural and emotional weight of what had happened. Every winter, when mist rose from the Thames and clung to the rooftops, people remembered. Mothers pulled children indoors at the first sign of haze, fathers warned their families not to linger outside, and grandparents retold stories of that December when the city itself seemed to suffocate. The smog had become more than an event. It had become a lesson passed from one generation to the next. At the same time, the tragedy inspired broader thinking about the environment. Scientists studying the smog began connecting it to global questions. What happened when entire nations filled the sky with smoke? If one city could be brought to its knees by its own pollution, what dangers might lie ahead for the world? These questions echoed far beyond London, influencing debates in Europe and America. Slowly, the Great Smog helped plant the seeds of the modern environmental movement. Literature and art continue to reflect the memory. Novels set in London often carried a quiet reference to the fog, a shorthand for loss and vulnerability. Poets compared the city's air to a betrayer, a silent killer that could not be fought with weapons. Painters evoked haunting images of blurred skylines and ghostly figures, using the smog as a metaphor for modern anxieties. Even films captured its atmosphere, portraying London as a place where beauty and danger lived side by side. Yet life itself showed signs of improvement. With smokeless zones expanding, many neighbourhoods reported clearer skies and fewer illnesses. Children born after the disaster grew up in a cleaner environment, though their parents' warnings remained sharp. The contrast between the older generation's memories and the younger generation's reality underscored how far the city had come and how much it had lost. Still, the smog lingered in unexpected ways. Survivors often described it as a turning point in their relationship with the city. Before 1952, fog had seemed harmless, even romantic. Afterward, it became a reminder of fragility, proof that progress carried risks as well as rewards. By the mid-1960s, London stood transformed, more aware, more cautious, but also more determined. The Great Smog had taken thousands of lives, yet it had also reshaped the future, making clear that the air itself was something worth protecting. By the late 1960s, the Great Smog was remembered not only as a tragedy, but as a moment that had reshaped the very identity of London. The city still bore the mark of those 5 days, an invisible scar that lingered in memory, policy, and even language. The word smog itself had changed forever. Once used lightly to describe fog mixed with smoke, it now carried an edge of fear. In everyday conversation, parents reminded children to stay inside when the air looked heavy. Doctors spoke of smog days as dangerous for the elderly. Journalists invoked the word whenever pollution levels rose, evoking an immediate sense of unease. The event had imprinted itself on the collective imagination, ensuring it would never fade into obscurity. Meanwhile, the Clean Air Act's influence expanded. New smokeless zones spread across the city, forcing households and businesses to adapt. Gradually, London began to look and feel different. Skies once painted grey with soot revealed more blue, and sunlight long filtered through haze returned with surprising clarity. Curtains stayed cleaner, laundry smelled fresher, and children played in parks without coughing as often. These changes, though subtle, carried enormous symbolic weight. They were proof that reform could make a difference, that the air could indeed be healed. Yet even as the air grew cleaner, scientists and historians warned that the lessons of 1952 must not be forgotten. Research continued to uncover the full toll of the disaster. Studies revealed that thousands more had died in the months following the smog than initially counted, victims of weakened lungs and compromised health. Entire communities had been shaped by the loss, and many survivors carried permanent damage. These revelations deepened the sense that the Great Smog had not been a short event but a long shadow stretching across years. In culture, too, the smog remained present. Plays portrayed London as a ghost city, where lanterns flickered in endless twilight. Memoirs described the eerie silence of streets without traffic, the terror of hospitals unable to cope. Even decades later, these works drew audiences, showing how powerfully the event had entered the city's story. By the end of the decade, the Great Smog was firmly established as both history and warning. It was remembered not simply as an environmental disaster, but as a moral lesson, that progress without care could become deadly, that the invisible could be as dangerous as the visible. London had survived, but the air itself had been revealed as fragile, precious, and forever in need of protection. As the 1970s began, the Great Smog of 1952 was no longer just a memory held by those who had lived through it. It had become a subject studied in universities, taught in schools, and discussed in global conferences. Environmentalism was beginning to rise as a movement, and London's tragedy was often cited as one of the clearest examples of what unchecked pollution could cause. In classrooms, teachers used the smog to explain the dangers of industrialisation without regulation. In lecture halls, scientists referred to it as a case study in atmospheric chemistry and public health. The story had grown beyond London, serving as a warning for cities around the world. While Britain was proud of the Clean Air Act, international observers recognised that it had been born out of loss. The law stood as both progress and memorial, a reminder carved into policy that thousands of lives had paid the price for change. In everyday life, the smog was still a quiet presence. Older generations told children about walking with scarves pressed over their mouths, about losing their way in streets they had known since childhood, about funerals postponed because hearses could not find cemeteries. These stories carried the weight of lived memory, shaping how young Londoners thought about the air around them. A foggy day was no longer seen as picturesque. It was a signal to be cautious, a reminder that the city had once suffocated. Cultural works reinforced this sense of caution. Films set in mid-century London often used smog as a backdrop, evoking not romance but danger. Writers wove the event into novels, treating it as a moment when the modern world revealed its fragility. Painters continued to capture ghostly images of blurred horizons and shadowed streets, ensuring the visual memory of the smog remained vivid even for those born after it. Yet alongside fear, there was pride. Many Londoners saw the transformation of their air as proof that their city could adapt and heal. The skies, though never perfectly clear, were brighter than they had been in generations. Children grew up in neighbourhoods where smog no longer crept under doors, and parks once hidden in haze opened fully to the sun. The improvement offered hope that progress and safety could coexist. Still, the smog's lesson was not forgotten. Policymakers invoked it in debates about industry, reminding one another of the cost of neglect. Scientists used it to advocate for stricter standards, both at home and abroad. The Great Smog had become more than history. It had become part of the moral fabric of environmental thought, a reminder etched into London's identity and the world's conscience. By the mid-1970s, the Great London Smog had taken on a dual identity. It was both history and warning. 20 years had passed since the disaster, yet its memory was kept alive not only by survivors, but also by policymakers, educators, and campaigners who saw it as proof that the environment could not be ignored. London itself had changed in visible ways. Smokeless zones had expanded, coal use in homes had declined, and new industries sought cleaner methods. Curtains no longer turned black in a matter of days, and school children could play outside without returning with soot-stained faces. The air was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. For many, this visible improvement was a quiet source of pride, a sign that the suffering of 1952 had not been in vain. Yet even as the city healed, the smog lingered in imagination. Survivors still recalled the eerie silence of those days, the way sound seemed muffled as if the city itself were holding its breath. They remembered carrying lanterns at midday, hearing the rattle of lungs in hospital wards, and watching entire neighbourhoods disappear into a wall of brown haze. These memories were retold in families, ensuring younger generations understood why their city looked brighter now. Schools played a role in preserving the lesson. Teachers included the Great Smog in history lessons, not as a passing weather event but as an environmental turning point. Students learned that thousands had died because of coal smoke, that governments had been forced to act, and that the disaster had led to cleaner air. For children born years later, the smog became part of their city's identity, a shadow in the past that shaped the air they breathed in the present. Beyond Britain, the story gained global relevance. Other nations, facing their own struggles with pollution, studied the Great Smog as a case of what could happen without regulation. In the United States, cities like Los Angeles drew lessons from London, implementing air quality standards inspired by Britain's reforms. Across Europe, the smog was invoked in discussions about balancing industry with health. London's tragedy had become the world's cautionary tale. The arts also kept the memory alive. Filmmakers recreated the gloom in documentaries, blending survivor interviews with images of shadowy streets. Writers continued to use the smog as a metaphor for hidden dangers of modern life. Even theatre productions evoked it, staging plays where fog became a character, unseen yet suffocating, shaping the fate of those on stage. The cultural weight of the smog ensured it would never be reduced to statistics alone. By the end of the 1970s, London was no longer the same city it had been in 1952. The skyline was clearer, the air lighter, and the streets less burdened by soot. Yet the lesson of the Great Smog remained sharp, that progress carried risks, and that vigilance was the price of safety. The disaster had been born from neglect, but its legacy was one of awareness, a reminder that even the air itself could turn against a city if left unprotected. As the 1980s arrived, the Great Smog of 1952 was still remembered, though now it belonged to the past of parents and grandparents, rather than to immediate daily fear. For Londoners who had lived through it, the memories remained vivid. Thick, suffocating air that clung to skin, the silence of halted traffic, and the funerals that stretched endlessly through December. For those born later, the smog had become part of the city's lore, passed down through stories, photographs, and lessons in school. The younger generation walked clearer streets, but they grew up under the shadow of a warning: never forget what the air can do. By then, the Clean Air Act had reshaped the city. Coal, once the very foundation of London life, had largely retreated. Factories installed filters, households switched to cleaner fuels, and smokeless zones extended farther each year. The difference was visible. London's skyline stood sharper against the horizon, and days of choking haze became rare. For many, this transformation offered a sense of progress, proof that tragedy could lead to change. Yet the memory of the Great Smog served as a reminder that progress was fragile. Scientists in the 1980s pointed out that while soot had declined, other forms of pollution, such as vehicle exhaust and chemical emissions, were rising. The air was clearer, but it was not harmless. The disaster of 1952 continued to be invoked in debates, a touchstone proving that environmental neglect carried human cost. Beyond London, the smog remained influential. Environmental movements across the world cited it as evidence for stricter laws. In cities like Los Angeles, Tokyo, and Mexico City, policymakers pointed to London's example, warning that the balance between industry and health was delicate. What had once been a local tragedy now served as a global case study. The arts of the 1980s reflected this enduring presence. Documentaries revisited the week of the smog, combining survivor testimonies with stark archival footage. Writers used it as a metaphor for hidden threats, comparing the silent spread of pollution to other unseen dangers of modern life. Plays depicted it as a battle between progress and nature, where neglect led to devastation. Through these cultural echoes, the smog lived on as more than memory. It became symbol. For ordinary Londoners, the disaster remained personal. Families who had lost loved ones still marked December with quiet remembrance. Conversations in living rooms returned to that week, when the air itself had turned hostile. Children listened, sometimes with disbelief, to tales of lanterns carried at noon, of hospitals so full that patients lay in corridors, of voices lost in the haze. The smog had become both cautionary tale and family history, shaping how generations understood their city. By the close of the 1980s, the Great Smog was over 3 decades past, yet its lesson was as sharp as ever. The cost of ignoring the air could never again be forgotten. By the 1990s, the Great London Smog had shifted from living memory into recorded history, yet its influence had not diminished. Survivors who were children in 1952 were now middle-aged, telling their own children and grandchildren what it felt like to walk through a city swallowed whole. They remembered the sting in their eyes, the taste of soot on their tongues, the strange quiet when even the sounds of traffic disappeared. These stories kept the tragedy alive, ensuring that each generation understood that London's clean skies had been earned at a heavy price. Academics devoted new studies to the event, drawing on hospital records, government reports, and personal diaries. They pieced together a fuller picture of the disaster, showing how the smog had not only killed thousands in those 5 days, but had left long-term scars on public health. Researchers found that survivors had higher rates of respiratory illness decades later, and that the death toll, once thought to be 4,000, was closer to 12,000. These findings shocked the public once more, reminding them that the fog had been even deadlier than once believed. Politicians, too, continued to invoke the Great Smog when discussing environmental policy. By the 1990s, vehicle emissions had become a new concern. Traffic filled London's streets in numbers unimaginable in the 1950s, and exhaust fumes replaced coal smoke as the city's major pollutant. Campaigners warned that while the skies looked clearer, invisible threats still remained. The Great Smog was used as proof that waiting too long to act could have devastating consequences. Globally, the event gained new attention. International conferences on climate change and air quality cited the Great Smog as one of the defining examples of industrial pollution gone unchecked. What had once been London's shame was now the world's warning, a reminder that progress without safeguards carried hidden dangers. Cultural memory also remained strong. Documentaries aired on television, drawing large audiences who watched in stunned silence as survivors recounted their experiences. Books blended history with personal testimony, ensuring the human side of the disaster was never overshadowed by statistics. Plays and films set in mid-century London often used the smog as a backdrop, a symbol of both fragility and transformation. For Londoners living in the 1990s, the smog was distant in time but close in spirit. Foggy mornings still stirred unease, and families still remembered those lost. Each December, newspapers published anniversary articles, revisiting the week when the city vanished. And though decades had passed, the lesson remained clear. Air, invisible and vital, could never be taken for granted again. As the year 2000 approached, the Great Smog of 1952 stood as one of the defining events of modern London's history. Nearly half a century had passed, and yet its shadow remained long. For those old enough to remember, the fog was not just a story, but a vivid memory etched into their senses. The smell of coal smoke, the feel of damp soot clinging to clothes, the terrifying blindness of midday darkness. They carried these memories into the new millennium, sharing them with children and grandchildren who could hardly imagine London as a place where the very air had turned hostile. By then, historians had gathered enough data to frame the smog not only as a local tragedy, but as one of the deadliest environmental disasters in European history. Detailed studies showed how hospitals had struggled, how families had coped, and how officials had failed to act in time. The number of dead, once cautiously reported as 4,000, was now widely accepted as closer to 12,000, with tens of thousands more left with damaged health. These numbers gave the event a scale comparable to wartime losses, placing it among the most sobering chapters in the city's story. Yet the smog was also remembered as the beginning of change. The Clean Air Act of 1956 and its later expansions were frequently cited as milestones in environmental legislation, not just for Britain, but as examples for the world. Politicians, environmentalists and educators pointed to London's tragedy when making the case for cleaner technologies, stricter emission standards, and more responsible urban planning. The message was simple. The past had shown the cost of neglect, and the future demanded vigilance. Cultural memory helped preserve the human side of the story. Television documentaries revisited the smog with archival footage, showing buses crawling through yellow-brown streets, pedestrians lost in gloom, and hospitals filled with coughing patients. Survivor interviews added haunting detail, descriptions of neighbours collapsing in doorways, of families unable to bury their dead, of children coughing through nights with no relief. These accounts ensured that the smog was not reduced to numbers, but remembered as a lived nightmare. As London prepared to enter the 21st century, the city looked very different. The air was clearer, the skyline more visible, and the idea of smog seemed almost unthinkable to a younger generation. Yet each December, articles and broadcasts reminded people of that week in 1952, when the city had learned that progress without foresight could become its own undoing. The Great Smog had become both a tragedy and a lesson, one that continued to shape not only London, but the way the world thought about the fragile balance between industry, environment, and human life. By the early 2000s, the Great Smog of 1952 had become firmly embedded in global environmental consciousness. It was no longer only a chapter of British history, but a reference point in discussions about pollution, climate, and the responsibilities of modern societies. Universities taught entire courses where the disaster was used as a case study. International organisations highlighted it as evidence that air quality was inseparable from human survival. London, once infamous for its smoke-filled skies, now stood as both a cautionary tale and a city that had, at least in part, redeemed itself. For Londoners, the smog remained a story passed through generations. Elderly survivors, their voices trembling but steady, continued to recount what it felt like to breathe air so heavy it seemed solid, to watch daylight vanish, to hear nothing but the coughs of neighbours. These memories shaped family histories, and younger listeners absorbed them with a mix of disbelief and reverence. Many found it difficult to imagine the familiar streets of modern London transformed into a deadly labyrinth of haze. Historians, meanwhile, delved deeper into the political and social aftermath. They revealed how unprepared the government had been, how long it had taken for officials to admit the scale of the disaster, and how reluctant some industries had been to change. These findings painted the smog not just as a natural event, but as a human failure, evidence of neglect, denial, and misplaced priorities. This narrative resonated with a new generation increasingly aware of global environmental crises. The story of 1952 became a mirror for contemporary challenges, a reminder that ignoring warning signs carried devastating costs. In culture, the smog continued to inspire. Documentaries reached new audiences on digital platforms, retelling the story with restored footage and interviews. Novels and plays explored its human dimension, turning statistics into characters, giving voice to those who had coughed, struggled, and endured. Even visual artists returned to the theme, painting cityscapes where light struggled through yellow fog, capturing both dread and resilience. For London itself, the smog had long since reshaped identity. The city, once famous for its pea supers, now prided itself on cleaner skies, yet the lesson lingered. Each time new discussions arose about rising car emissions, industrial growth or climate change, the Great Smog was recalled. It was invoked in Parliament, in classrooms, and in living rooms, a reminder that vigilance was necessary because air was not guaranteed. It had to be protected. Half a century had passed, but the Great Smog remained alive, not only as a memory of death but as a voice urging caution, responsibility, and awareness for the generations to come. By the 2010s, the Great Smog of 1952 had settled into history, but its presence was still keenly felt in discussions about modern air pollution. As cities worldwide grappled with smog, greenhouse gases, and climate change, London's tragedy was often cited as one of the earliest and clearest examples of how environmental neglect could turn deadly. International conferences invoked it regularly, reminding leaders that the consequences of inaction could be measured not only in statistics, but in lives lost. The Great Smog had become more than a London story. It was a global lesson. For younger Londoners, the event was something they learned in schools, through documentaries, and in anniversary features that aired each December. They grew up in a city far removed from the choking haze of the 1950s, yet their understanding of clean air was shaped by that week of darkness. Teachers presented the smog as both a historical event and a warning, weaving it into lessons about science, politics, and social responsibility. In this way, the memory remained alive, not as lived experience but as inherited knowledge. Survivors, fewer in number now, continued to share their stories whenever asked. Interviews with elderly Londoners revealed vivid recollections. Children walking with scarves pressed to their faces, bus drivers abandoning vehicles in the gloom, neighbours failing to return home. Their voices carried a sense of urgency, a plea not to forget. Many remarked that the danger had not been dramatic. It had been silent, creeping into lungs with every breath. That quiet menace became a symbol, resonating with modern audiences facing invisible pollutants of their own. Meanwhile, cultural retellings kept shaping the way people imagine the smog. Films recreated the ghostly atmosphere with computer effects, bringing to life the yellow-brown haze and the muffled city it created. Novels used it as a metaphor for modern alienation, portraying characters lost not only in fog but in confusion and neglect. Art exhibitions displayed paintings of London blurred into near abstraction, asking viewers to reflect on fragility and resilience. These representations ensured that the smog did not fade into mere dates and numbers, but remained something tangible, something that could be felt emotionally as well as understood intellectually. In policy debates, the smog was invoked whenever new regulations were considered. As concerns about climate change deepened, politicians reminded citizens that Britain had already faced one great environmental reckoning, and that it had taken thousands of deaths to spark action. The past, in this sense, served as leverage for the present, reinforcing the idea that change was not optional, but necessary. By the 2010s, London stood as a city transformed, with cleaner air and clearer skies than in decades past. Yet the Great Smog of 1952 remained woven into its identity, a story of darkness, loss, and eventual awakening. It was a reminder that the air we breathe, invisible and taken for granted, is fragile, and when neglected it can turn against us with devastating force. As the 2020s began, the Great London Smog of 1952 was nearly 70 years in the past, yet its shadow still stretched across the modern world. In an era of rising concern about climate change, wildfires and air quality crises in major cities, the smog was no longer treated only as a piece of British history, but as a universal cautionary tale. International media often revisited it, drawing parallels between London's tragedy and present-day events in places like Beijing, Delhi or Los Angeles, where haze and particulate matter threatened millions. The smog's lesson, that air itself could become an unseen killer, remained painfully relevant. In London, commemorations continued. Each anniversary brought documentaries, articles and discussions reminding residents that their city had once been brought to its knees by its own smoke. Survivors were few now, but their voices carried weight. Recorded interviews replayed their accounts, stumbling through streets where even lampposts vanished, hospitals so crowded that patients lay in hallways, funerals delayed because hearses could not find their way. These testimonies gave human depth to what might otherwise seem distant history. Younger generations growing up in a London of clearer skies often struggled to imagine their city in such darkness. Yet education kept the memory alive. Schools presented the smog in history and science lessons, showing how choices about fuel, energy and policy had directly shaped human survival. Children learned that the Clean Air Act had not been an abstract reform, but a law written in response to loss, paid for with thousands of lives. This made the story more than historical. It made it personal, a lesson about responsibility inherited across generations. Globally, the smog remained a reference point. Environmentalists invoked it to push for stronger air quality standards, while climate activists cited it as proof that governments only act when tragedy strikes. In political debates, the Great Smog served as a reminder that prevention is cheaper than catastrophe, and that ignoring warning signs invites disaster. In culture, the smog retained its haunting quality. Films and television dramas depicted 1950s London as a city consumed by a living fog, blending historical accuracy with metaphor. Writers used the event to explore themes of neglect, fragility, and resilience. Visual artists reimagined the city as a blurred silhouette, lanterns glowing faintly in the haze, symbolizing both danger and endurance. Through these cultural echoes, the smog continued to live not only as history but as symbol. By the early 2020s, air pollution remained a global crisis, but London itself stood transformed. The skyline, once hidden, was visible more often than not. The city had remade its identity, moving from the fog capital of the world to a leader in air regulation. Yet the Great Smog endured in memory, not as a relic but as a warning carved into the story of a city and, increasingly, into the conscience of the world. By the mid-2020s, the Great London Smog was a story remembered almost entirely through records, books and recordings, yet its lessons felt sharper than ever. The world was facing new environmental challenges: climate change, wildfires, industrial haze, and urban pollution on a scale far beyond what London had known in 1952. And so, the smog was often invoked not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror reflecting the dangers of the present. News articles compared photographs of London's pea super with modern images of smog-choked cities in Asia, showing that history had repeated itself in new forms. Politicians, activists and scientists quoted the Great Smog as proof that air quality could never be ignored, because its cost was measured in lives. In Britain itself, the smog was woven into public identity. Museums curated exhibits that reconstructed the event with immersive technology. Rooms filled with simulated fog, recordings of coughing crowds, and projected lanterns glowing in the darkness. Visitors, especially young ones, were struck by how terrifyingly real it felt. These exhibitions ensured that even generations born long after 1952 could grasp the human toll. In classrooms, teachers presented the disaster as part of broader environmental history, linking it to the Clean Air Act, to global pollution controls, and to today's debates about climate policy. The smog was no longer just a story of London. It was a universal example of what happens when warnings are ignored. Survivors, though few remained, were honoured as witnesses. Their voices, preserved in interviews played on television specials and online archives. They described how the city fell silent, how buses abandoned the roads, how hospitals filled until nurses wept in exhaustion. These personal memories gave weight to the statistics, reminding audiences that behind every number was a face, a life, a story cut short. The cultural presence of the smog also persisted. Writers used it as metaphor for neglect, for the unseen dangers of progress, for the fragility of systems people take for granted. Artists painted blurred cityscapes, not simply as history, but as commentary on modern crises. Filmmakers recreated the suffocating gloom with modern effects, reminding audiences that London itself had once lived through a nightmare that could return if vigilance failed. By the 2020s, London had remade its reputation. Its skies were cleaner, its air regulated, its identity reshaped from the fog capital to a city of lessons learned. Yet the Great Smog remained one of its defining chapters. It was tragedy, memory, warning, and catalyst all at once. And though decades had passed, the truth remained the same. The air we breathe, invisible and easy to forget, is both life and danger, something that must always be guarded, for the cost of forgetting is written in the shadows of December 1952. As the 70th anniversary of the Great London Smog approached in 2022, reflections on that December grew sharper and more urgent. Newspapers revisited the tragedy with long features, recounting how a modern city had been brought to its knees by its own smoke. Documentaries aired across television and streaming platforms, blending archival footage with survivor interviews, reminding audiences of the scale of loss. For many younger Londoners, these programmes were their first true encounter with the details, how the fog had turned noon into night, how ambulances stood still, how thousands had slipped quietly into death. The anniversary also carried a tone of warning. Environmental groups drew direct connections between 1952 and the present, arguing that the world was facing dangers of its own making. Where coal smoke once suffocated London, now carbon emissions and industrial waste threatened the planet on a larger scale. Activists used the smog as a rallying point, proof that governments act too slowly until tragedy forces their hand. "Never again" was the phrase that echoed through speeches and articles, though it carried a double edge, a vow not to repeat the past, but also a reminder that similar risks loomed in the present. In London, commemorations were both solemn and educational. Museums hosted exhibitions that recreated the atmosphere of the smog with immersive technology, allowing visitors to walk through simulated haze while hearing the sounds of coughing crowds. Schools organised lessons where students read first-hand accounts from 1952, understanding not just the statistics, but the human experiences. Churches held memorial services for the thousands lost, their names largely unrecorded, their memory carried instead in the collective sorrow of the city. Internationally, the anniversary prompted fresh discussion about air pollution. News outlets compared London's 1952 disaster with modern crises in cities where haze still blankets the sky. Experts warned that while London had cleaned its air, billions elsewhere faced dangers just as grave. The Great Smog, once a local tragedy, had become a global parable. Yet even in remembrance there was acknowledgement of progress. London's cleaner air, its smokeless zones, and its cultural shift away from coal stood as proof that reform was possible. Survivors who spoke during the anniversary events often emphasised this. The smog had been devastating, but it had also forced change that saved lives in the decades that followed. For many, that was its enduring legacy, a tragedy that became catalyst. As the anniversary passed, London stood as a city transformed, but still marked by memory. The Great Smog remained a ghost in its history, invisible, suffocating, unforgettable, and eternally instructive. 70 years on, the Great London Smog remains one of the most haunting reminders of how fragile the balance between human progress and nature can be. It began as ordinary winter fog, yet within days it became a silent killer, claiming thousands of lives and leaving a mark on history that has never faded. The story of that December is not only about tragedy, but also about transformation, how a city forced into grief found the resolve to change. London after 1952 was never the same. The disaster sparked conversations that reshaped law, science, and culture. The Clean Air Act of 1956 and later reforms transformed the way the city powered itself, moving away from coal and toward cleaner energy. These changes were not immediate or easy, but they laid the groundwork for the clearer skies that later generations would inherit. Each improvement became a testament to the lives lost, proof that their suffering had not been in vain. Beyond policy, the Great Smog lived on in memory and imagination. Survivors carried it in their lungs and in their hearts, passing down stories that painted a vivid picture of streets swallowed by haze and silence broken only by coughs and footsteps. Writers turned those days into metaphors for neglect and resilience. Painters captured ghostly skylines where light barely pierced the darkness, and filmmakers recreated the suffocating gloom to remind audiences of how close the past still felt. In classrooms and museums, the smog became a lesson about responsibility, a story told not to frighten, but to warn. Globally, the event became a cornerstone in environmental awareness. Cities across the world looked to London as both a warning and an example, proof that pollution unchecked could destroy, but also that reform was possible. It influenced policies far beyond Britain, shaping debates in Europe, America, and Asia about the air people breathe and the unseen dangers that can dwell within it. Today, London's skies are clearer, its air far healthier than in the days of coal fires and soot-stained curtains. Yet the lesson of December 1952 endures. Every discussion of climate change, every call for cleaner cities, every reminder to protect the environment echoes the truth first revealed in that week of darkness. The air is life itself, invisible yet vital, and it must never be taken for granted. The Great London Smog was a tragedy that stole thousands of lives in silence, but it also became a turning point, a moment when the city, and eventually the world, recognised that survival depends not only on progress, but on the care we take with the very breath we share. Its shadow will always remain, not as a weight, but as a guidepost, reminding us that even the unseen can shape history.